The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Lance Corporal James Morrison took his position for what he expected would be another routine day of ceremonial duty. At 24 years old, James had been serving as a Royal Guard for just 8 months. Having transferred from active combat duty in the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers after completing 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, James carried himself with the quiet dignity and unshakable composure that marked all members of the elite Royal Guard unit. His red tunic was pressed to perfection, every button polished to a mirror shine, and his bearskin hat sat at precisely the correct angle, as prescribed by centuries of military tradition. To observers, he appeared to be the very picture of British military precision and ceremonial excellence. However, beneath the immaculate exterior, James was carrying a burden that few people knew about and that he had been struggling with for months. During his final deployment in Afghanistan, James had been involved in a tragic incident that had haunted him ever since his return to British soil. His unit had been conducting a routine patrol in a village outside Kabul when they came under surprise attack from insurgent forces hiding among civilian buildings. In the chaos and confusion of the firefight, James had been forced to make a split-second decision that saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers but resulted in civilian casualties. The official investigation had cleared him of any wrongdoing, concluding that his actions were justified under the rules of engagement and had prevented far greater loss of life. His commanding officers had praised his quick thinking and decisive action under extreme pressure, but James could not forgive himself for what had happened. The faces of the innocent people who had died haunted his dreams, and he carried a crushing weight of guilt and responsibility that no amount of official exoneration could lift from his shoulders. He had requested transfer to ceremonial duties, partly as a way to serve his country in a role that would never again require him to make life or death decisions about other human beings. The transition from active combat to ceremonial duties had been more difficult than James had anticipated. The skills that had kept him alive in war zones, constant vigilance, quick reflexes, and the ability to assess and respond to threats instantly were not easily turned off during peaceful ceremonial duties at the palace. He found himself struggling with hypervigilance and anxiety, particularly in crowded situations with lots of movement and noise. James had been seeing a military counselor to help him process his combat experiences and adjust to his new role. But progress was slow and difficult. The guilt he carried made it hard for him to accept praise or recognition for his service, and he often felt like a fraud when people thanked him for his sacrifice or called him a hero. In his own mind, he was someone who had failed to protect innocent people when it mattered most. His fellow guards had noticed that James was quieter and more withdrawn than most new transfers, but they attributed it to the normal adjustment period that all combat veterans experienced when transitioning to ceremonial duties. The rigid structure and precise protocols of Royal Guard service could be comforting to soldiers coming off combat deployments, providing a sense of order and predictability that was often missing from active war zones. On this particular morning, James was assigned to one of the most visible and important posts at the palace, the position directly outside the main entrance where he would be seen by hundreds of tourists, dignitaries, and members of the royal household throughout the day. It was considered an honor to be assigned to such a prominent position, especially for someone with relatively limited experience in ceremonial duties. As James took his position and began his shift, he followed the time-honored routine that had been performed by thousands of guards before him. He stood at attention with perfect posture, his eyes focused straight ahead, his expression completely neutral and professional. To the outside world, he appeared to be the very embodiment of British military tradition and excellence. The morning proceeded normally, with the usual flow of tourists taking photographs, children pointing and waving, and palace staff going about their daily business. James maintained his motionless stance throughout, just as he had been trained to do, ignoring all attempts by tourists to get his attention or provoke a reaction from him. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, the normal routine was interrupted by an unusual level of activity near the palace entrance. Palace staff members were moving with obvious purpose and urgency. Security personnel were taking positions, and there were clear signs that someone of significant importance was about to arrive or depart from the building. James remained at his post, maintaining his professional demeanor while mentally noting the increased activity around him. His combat experience had taught him to be aware of changes in his environment without appearing to be actively observing, and he could sense the heightened alertness of the security team without breaking his ceremonial pose. Within minutes, the reason for the increased activity became clear as Queen Camilla emerged from the palace entrance, accompanied by her personal protection officers and several members of her household staff. She was dressed elegantly in a navy blue coat and matching hat, moving with the grace and dignity that had characterized her public appearances since becoming queen consort. Queen Camilla paused near the entrance, apparently waiting for her vehicle to be brought around, and her attention was drawn to James, standing at his ceremonial post. She observed him for a moment, noting his perfect military bearing and the obvious pride he took in his appearance and duties. Even though she could not see the inner struggles he was facing, what happened next was completely unexpected and would create a situation that no amount of protocol training had prepared James to handle. Queen Camilla, moved by something she saw in the young guard's demeanor, or perhaps simply wanting to acknowledge his service, approached James's position and did something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and his own worth as a soldier. The encounter that was about to unfold would not only shock everyone who witnessed it, but would also begin a healing process for James that he had not thought possible. Sometimes the most profound moments of recognition and redemption come from the most unexpected sources, and Queen Camilla was about to demonstrate the power of genuine human compassion to touch the deepest wounds carried by those who serve. Queen Camilla approached James's position with the measured pace and dignified bearing that had become her trademark during public appearances. However, there was something different about her demeanor this morning, a sense of purpose and intent that suggested this was not merely a casual observation of ceremonial protocol, but something more personal and meaningful. As she drew closer to where James stood at perfect attention, Queen Camilla's experienced eye took in details that most observers would have missed. She noticed the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his composure. She observed the way his eyes remained fixed, straight ahead with an intensity that seemed to go beyond normal ceremonial requirements, as if he were using his training as a shield against something deeper and more troubling. Queen Camilla had spent years learning to read people during her royal duties, and her extensive charity work with military veterans and their families had given her particular insight into the signs of combat, stress, and emotional trauma that many soldiers carried long after their return from deployment. She had met hundreds of veterans over the years, and she had developed an intuitive ability to recognize those who were struggling with invisible wounds. Something about James reminded her of other young soldiers she had encountered during her visits to military hospitals and veteran support centers. There was a weight in his bearing that went beyond the physical demands of standing at attention for hours. It was the weight of someone who had seen too much, experienced too much, and was carrying burdens that were too heavy for one person to bear alone. The queen consort had been briefed on the backgrounds of the guards who had served at the palace, and she knew that Lance Corporal Orison was a decorated combat veteran who had recently transferred from active duty to ceremonial service. She also knew, through her connections with military mental health services, that such transitions were often more difficult than they appeared from the outside. Queen Camilla stopped directly in front of James, close enough that he could see her clearly in his peripheral vision without moving his eyes from their forward focus. For a moment, she simply stood there, studying his face and posture with the kind of attention that suggested she was seeing him not just as a ceremonial figure, but as an individual human being with his own story and struggles. What Queen Camilla did next was completely unprecedented in the modern history of royal protocol and ceremonial duties. Instead of simply acknowledging James with a nod or a word of appreciation, as was customary during informal encounters with guards, she did something that shocked her own security detail and left palace staff members speechless. Queen Camilla slowly and deliberately raised her right hand to her forehead and rendered a perfect military salute to Lance Corporal James Morrison. The salute was executed with precision and held for several seconds, not the casual gesture of someone unfamiliar with military customs, but the crisp, respectful salute of someone who understood its meaning and significance. The moment was captured by several tourists who happened to have their cameras ready, but the true impact was felt by James himself, who suddenly found his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of unexpected recognition and respect from the very person he had sworn to protect and serve. James had received salutes from fellow soldiers, from superior officers, and from civilians who wanted to show their appreciation for military service. But he had never received a salute from a member of the royal family, the very people whose service and protection gave meaning to his oath of allegiance and his commitment to duty. The salute continued for what felt like an eternity to James, though it was probably no more than 5 or 6 seconds in reality. During those moments, he found himself struggling with emotions that he had been suppressing for months. The guilt, the trauma, the sense of unworthiness that had plagued him since his return from Afghanistan suddenly seemed to be challenged. By this unexpected gesture of respect and recognition, Queen Camilla maintained her salute with perfect form, expression serious and respectful, clearly understanding the significance of what she was doing and the impact it would have on the young soldiers standing before her. This was not a public relations gesture or a photo opportunity. This was a genuine moment of recognition from one person to another, acknowledging sacrifice and service in the most direct and meaningful way possible. The palace staff members, who witnessed the encounter, stood in respectful silence. Recognizing that they were observing something extraordinary and unprecedented, security personnel maintained their positions but found themselves moved by the sight of their queen, showing such personal respect to a fellow service member. James felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. Though years of military training and discipline helped him maintain his outward composure, the salute from Queen Camilla was beginning to penetrate the wall of guilt and self-doubt that he had built around himself since his return from combat. For the first time in months, he began to feel that perhaps his service had meaning and value, that perhaps the sacrifices he had made and the difficult decisions he had been forced to make were recognized and appreciated by those who mattered. Most, Queen Camilla slowly lowered her hand, completing the salute with the same precision and respect with which she had begun it. But instead of immediately moving on, as protocol would normally dictate, she remained in position, her eyes now meeting James's directly, conveying a message of understanding and appreciation that went far deeper than words could express. The Queen Consort had made a decision in that moment that would impact not only James, but everyone who witnessed or learned about the encounter. She had chosen to break with protocol, to risk criticism for inappropriate behavior, in order to provide recognition and healing to a young soldier who desperately needed to know that his service mattered and that his sacrifices were seen and valued. What happened next would complete the transformation of a routine ceremonial duty into a moment of profound human connection that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. After completing her salute, Queen Camilla did something that shocked everyone present even more than her initial gesture. Instead of moving on with her scheduled activities as royal protocol would normally require, she remained in position and began to speak directly to James in a voice that was quiet enough to be private, but clear enough for those nearby to understand the significance of her words. "Lance Corporal Morrison," Queen Camilla said, using his rank and name with the precision of someone who had made it her business to know exactly who he was and what his service record contained. "I want you to know that your service to this country, both in combat and in your current duties, is deeply appreciated and will never be forgotten." James felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to falter as the Queen Consort continued to address him directly. No member of the royal family had ever spoken to him personally during his ceremonial duties. The fact that Queen Camilla knew his name and rank suggested that this encounter was not spontaneous, but had been planned with careful consideration of his personal circumstances and needs. "I have been briefed on your distinguished service in Afghanistan and Iraq," Queen Camilla continued, her voice carrying a warmth and sincerity that penetrated the formal atmosphere of the palace courtyard. "I know that you served with exceptional courage and saved the lives of your fellow soldiers under the most difficult and dangerous circumstances imaginable. The words hit James like a physical blow, challenging directly the guilt and self-doubt that had consumed him since his return from deployment. For months, he had focused obsessively on the civilian casualties that had resulted from his actions. Unable to accept the official finding that his split-second decisions had been justified and necessary to prevent even greater loss of life, Queen. Camilla's next words would prove to be the most healing and transformative that James had heard since his return from combat. She stepped slightly closer, ensuring that her words would be heard clearly despite the noise of the busy London street and the crowds of tourists who were beginning to gather to witness the unprecedented scene. "I want you to understand something. Very important, Lance Corporal Morrison," the Queen Consort said with quiet intensity. "The decisions you were forced to make in combat do not define your worth as a soldier or as a human being. What defines you is your willingness to serve others, even at great personal cost, and your continued dedication to duty, even when that service brings you no recognition or glory." James found himself struggling to maintain the stoic expression required of royal guards as Queen Camilla's words began to chip away at the wall of guilt and shame he had built around himself. The tears that he had been fighting to suppress since the beginning of the encounter were now threatening to overflow. Though his military training helped him maintain enough composure to continue standing at attention, the crowd of onlookers had grown significantly, with tourists, palace staff, and even some members of the media beginning to take notice of the extraordinary interaction taking place between the Queen Consort and the young royal guard. Many were recording the encounter on their phones, though the full significance of what they were witnessing would not become clear until later. Queen Camilla was fully aware of the attention her actions were drawing, but she had made a conscious decision that the healing and recognition of a struggling veteran was more important than strict adherence to royal protocol. Her years of charity work with military families had taught her that sometimes the most powerful interventions were also the most personal and direct. "The men whose lives you saved have families who will celebrate Christmas with them this year because of your actions," Queen Camilla continued, her voice now carrying the emotional weight of someone who genuinely understood the stakes involved in combat decisions. "The children who will grow up with their fathers, the wives who will grow old with their husbands, the parents who will not have to bury their sons, they all owe their happiness to your courage and quick thinking." This perspective was one that James had never allowed himself to consider during the months of self-recrimination and guilt that had followed his return from Afghanistan. His military counselors had tried to help him understand the positive outcomes of his actions, but he had been unable to hear their words through the noise of his own self-blame and trauma. Hearing the same message from Queen Camilla, delivered with such personal conviction and obvious sincerity, began to create cracks in the wall of guilt that had imprisoned James's ability to see his service clearly. For the first time since the incident in Afghanistan, he began to allow himself to consider that perhaps his actions had been necessary and justified, that perhaps the lives he had saved outweighed the tragic losses that had resulted from an impossible situation. Queen Camilla could see the impact her words were having on the young soldier, and she made a decision to complete her intervention with a gesture that would provide James with something tangible to remember and hold onto during future moments of doubt and despair. Reaching into her handbag, Queen Camilla retrieved a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. She wrote something quickly, tore out the page, folded it carefully, and handed it to James with instructions that completed the most unprecedented interaction between a monarch and a royal guard in modern British history. "Lance Corporal Morrison, I want you to keep this with you," Queen Camilla said as she pressed the folded paper into his gloved hand. "When the weight of service becomes too heavy to bear alone, when the memories become too painful to endure, I want you to read these words and remember that your queen recognizes your sacrifice and honors your service." The folded paper felt impossibly heavy in James's hand, carrying with it not just the written words of the Queen Consort, but also the full weight of royal recognition and personal appreciation for his service. He managed to accept the paper and secure it in his uniform pocket while maintaining his ceremonial posture. Though the emotional impact of the gesture was written clearly on his face, the crowd of onlookers burst into spontaneous applause as they realized they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. a moment when protocol and formality had been set aside in favor of human compassion and recognition of service. Many were wiping away tears as they understood the significance of what Queen Camilla had done for the struggling young soldier. As the applause from the crowd continued, Queen Camilla made one final gesture that would complete her unprecedented demonstration of respect and recognition for Lance Corporal Morrison's service. She stepped back, came to attention herself with perfect military bearing, and saluted James once more, holding the salute even longer than the first time. This second salute was different from the first, both its duration and its meaning. Where the first had been a gesture of recognition and respect, this second salute was a formal acknowledgement from the Queen Consort to a soldier who had served with distinction and honor. Despite the personal cost he had paid for that service, James, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment but still bound by his duty and training, returned Queen Camilla's salute with military precision. For several seconds, Queen Consort and the Royal Guard stood in perfect military salute to each other, creating an image that would be captured by dozens of cameras and shared around the world within hours. The symbolic power of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Here was the Queen Consort, representing the very pinnacle of British society and tradition, showing the deepest possible respect to a young soldier who had been struggling with feelings of unworthiness and guilt. Principle that true nobility comes not from birth or position, but from service and sacrifice. When both salutes were finally lowered, Queen Camilla spoke once more, this time loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear her words clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the tourists and onlookers who had witnessed the encounter, "you have just met one of Britain's finest soldiers, a young man who has served his country with exceptional courage and continues to serve with dedication and honor." The crowd responded with another round of enthusiastic applause. But this time, the applause was directed specifically at James, who found himself the center of positive attention in a way he had not experienced since. Before his deployment to Afghanistan, the recognition from Queen Camilla had transformed him in the eyes of the observers from a ceremonial figure into a real person with a story of service and sacrifice worthy of respect and admiration. James maintained his military composure throughout the applause, but those watching closely could see the profound emotional impact the encounter was having on him. The rigid mask of professional indifference that he had worn for months was beginning to crack, replaced by something more human and vulnerable, but also more genuine and hopeful. After the applause died down, Queen Camilla approached James one final time, speaking quietly so that only he could hear her words. "Lance Corporal Morrison, I want you to know that if you ever need support, guidance, or simply someone to talk to about your service, my office has connections with the finest military counselors and veteran support services in the country. You are not alone in carrying the weight of your experiences." This offer of ongoing support was perhaps the most meaningful part of the entire encounter for James. The isolation and loneliness that had characterized his struggle with combat trauma suddenly felt less overwhelming when he realized that the Queen Consort herself was offering to ensure he had access to whatever help he might need. "Your service matters," Queen Camilla concluded. "Your sacrifices have meaning, and your country is grateful for everything you have given in defense of our values and our people. Never forget that, no matter how dark the memories become or how heavy the burden feels." With those final words, Queen Camilla stepped back, nodded respectfully to James, and began to move toward her waiting vehicle. But the impact of her intervention would continue long after she had left the palace grounds, beginning a process of healing and recognition that would transform James's understanding of his own worth and value as both a soldier and a human being. The crowd began to disperse, but many people approached James's position to offer their own words of thanks and appreciation. Tourists who had initially seen him as merely a colorful part of the British pageantry now understood that he was a real person with a story of service and sacrifice that deserved recognition and respect. Palace staff members who had witnessed the encounter were equally moved by what they had seen. Many had worked at the palace for years and had never witnessed such a personal and meaningful interaction between a member of the royal family and a serving soldier. the story would spread quickly through the palace community and beyond, creating ripples of inspiration and respect that would extend far beyond the immediate participants. James's fellow guards, who had been watching from their own positions around the palace, were also deeply affected by what they had witnessed. Many of them were combat veterans themselves, carrying their own invisible wounds and struggling with their own transitions from active duty to ceremonial service. Seeing one of their own receive such recognition and support from Queen Camilla gave them hope that their own service was valued and appreciated. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes from beginning to end, but its impact would be measured not in minutes, but in the fundamental change it created in James's understanding of his own worth and the meaning of his service. For the first time since his return from Afghanistan, he began to feel that perhaps he was not a fraud or a failure, but a soldier who had served with honor under impossible circumstances. As Queen Camilla's vehicle pulled away from the palace, she glanced back through the window at James, who was still standing at his post, but now carried himself with a subtle but noticeable difference. The weight of guilt and shame that had burdened his posture for months seemed lighter, replaced by something that might eventually grow into pride and self-acceptance. The Queen Consort knew that her intervention was only the beginning of James's healing process, not its completion. But she also knew that sometimes the most important step in recovery is the first recognition that recovery is possible, and that the service and sacrifice of soldiers like James Morrison are seen, valued, and honored by the people and institutions they have sworn to protect. The remainder of James's shift passed in a blur of heightened emotion and renewed purpose. Word of Queen Camilla's unprecedented salute and recognition had spread quickly throughout the palace staff, and James found himself receiving nods of respect and quiet words of encouragement from colleagues who had previously seen him. It's just another new transfer struggling to adjust to ceremonial duties. When his shift ended that afternoon, James carefully made his way to a quiet corner of the palace grounds before retrieving the folded paper that Queen Camilla had given him. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, uncertain what words the Queen Consort had chosen to write for him during those brief moments of their encounter. The message was written in Queen Camilla's own handwriting, elegant but clearly personal, rather than formal. It read, "Lance Corporal Morrison, your courage in combat and your continued dedication to service represent the very best of British values. The lives you saved, the comrades you protected, and the duty you continue to fulfill, with honor, are testimony to your character and your worth. When the darkness feels overwhelming, remember that your Queen sees your service, values your sacrifice, and is proud to be protected by soldiers like you. You are not defined by your worst moments, but by your willingness to serve others, despite the personal cost." Camilla R. James read the message 3 times before the full weight of its words began to sink in. For months he had been trapped in a cycle of guilt and self-blame, focusing obsessively on the tragic consequences of his combat decisions while ignoring the lives he had saved and the service he continued to provide. Queen Camilla's words offered him a different lens through which to view his experiences and his worth as a soldier and as a person. The phrase, "You are not defined by your worst moments, but by your willingness to serve others, despite the personal cost," particularly resonated with James. It challenged directly the narrative of failure, an inadequacy that had dominated his thoughts since his return from Afghanistan. For the first time, he began to consider the possibility that his worst day as a soldier did not erase all of his best days, that his continued service might have value even in the shadow of past trauma. Over the following days, the video footage and photographs of Queen Camilla's salute to James spread rapidly across social media and news outlets around the world. The story captured public imagination, not just because of its unprecedented nature, but because it represented something that many people found inspiring and moving: the recognition of service and sacrifice by someone in a position of ultimate authority and respect. Comments poured in from military veterans around the world who related to James's struggle with combat trauma and found hope in Queen Camilla's demonstration of recognition and support. Active duty soldiers shared the story, as an example of how their service was valued and appreciated even when they felt isolated or forgotten. Civilian supporters of the military saw the encounter as a powerful reminder of the human cost of military service and the importance of supporting veterans in their transition back to civilian or peacetime duties. The story also sparked broader conversations about combat trauma, veteran mental health, and the challenges faced by soldiers returning from deployment. Mental health advocates praised Queen Camilla for using her platform to highlight these issues and for demonstrating the power of personal recognition and support in the healing process. James found himself struggling to adjust to the sudden attention his story was receiving. He had always preferred to serve quietly and without fanfare, and the idea of being the subject of international news coverage was uncomfortable and overwhelming. However, his commanding officers helped him understand that his story was providing hope and inspiration to other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. Captain Reynolds, James's commanding officer, called him in for a personal meeting to discuss the impact of the encounter and to ensure that James was receiving appropriate support during what was clearly a significant transition in his recovery process. Morrison, I want you to know that Queen Camilla's recognition of your service reflects the opinion of this entire command structure, Captain Reynolds said. You are a valued member of this unit, and your service both in combat and in your current duties is exemplary. The conversation with Captain Reynolds was important for James because it reinforced Queen Camilla's message with official recognition from his military superiors. The combination of royal acknowledgement and military support began to create a foundation of external validation that helped James began to challenge his own internal narrative of inadequacy and failure. James also began working more intensively with his military counselor, Dr. Sarah Thompson, who helped him process the encounter with Queen Camilla and use it as a catalyst for deeper healing and recovery. What Queen Camilla did for you was provide external validation of your worth and service, Dr. Thompson explained. Now we need to help you internalize that validation so that your sense of self-worth doesn't depend entirely on external recognition. The sessions with Dr. Thompson became more productive and meaningful after the encounter with Queen Camilla. Having received such powerful recognition of his service, James was more willing to engage in the difficult work of processing his combat trauma and challenging the guilt and self-blame that had dominated his thoughts for months. 3 weeks after the encounter, James received an invitation that would provide another opportunity for healing and recognition. Queen Camilla's office had arranged for him to attend a private reception for military veterans and their families, where he would have the opportunity to meet other soldiers who had struggled with similar challenges and to see firsthand the impact of the support services that Queen Camilla had mentioned during their encounter. The invitation represented more than just a social event. It was a demonstration that Queen Camilla's offer of ongoing support had been genuine, and that her intervention in his life was not a single gesture, but the beginning of a longer-term commitment to his well-being and recovery. As James prepared for the reception, he reflected on how much his life had changed in the weeks since Queen Camilla's unexpected salute. The crushing weight of guilt and shame that had characterized his daily existence for months had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time since his return from Afghanistan, he began to feel that recovery and healing might actually be possible, and that his service and sacrifice had meaning and value that extended beyond his worst moments in combat. The private reception hosted by Queen Camilla took place at Clarence House 3 weeks after the salute incident, and it proved to be another transformative experience for James. The event brought together 40 military veterans and their families, all of whom had been supported by various programs and initiatives that Queen Camilla had championed throughout her royal duties. As James entered the elegant reception room, he was struck by the warmth and informality of the atmosphere. Despite the grandeur of the setting, Queen Camilla had created an environment where veterans felt comfortable sharing their stories, their struggles, and their successes in recovery and adjustment to civilian life. James found himself in conversation with other combat veterans who had faced similar challenges with trauma, guilt, and the difficulty of finding purpose and meaning after military service. For the first time since his return from Afghanistan, he realized that he was not alone in his struggles, and that many of the feelings yet interpreted as signs of personal weakness, were actually common experiences among combat veterans. One particularly meaningful conversation was with Sarah Mitchell, a former Royal Air Force medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. She had struggled with survivor guilt after losing patients despite her best efforts, and she understood intimately the self-blame and questioning that had consumed James since his return from combat. "The thing that saved me," Sarah told James, "was realizing that the guilt I felt was actually a sign of how much I cared about doing the right thing. The fact that you're haunted by the civilian casualties shows that you're a good person who takes responsibility seriously.
Add soldiers.
Don't lose sleep over collateral damage. Good soldiers do." This perspective was revolutionary for James. He had interpreted his guilt and trauma as evidence of his failure and inadequacy as a soldier. Sarah helped him understand that his emotional response to the tragic outcomes of his combat decisions was actually evidence of his moral character and his commitment to protecting innocent life. Even in impossible circumstances, Queen Camilla made a point of spending time with each veteran at the reception. But her conversation with James was particularly meaningful because it built upon the foundation of their earlier encounter. "Corporal Morrison, I hope you're beginning to understand that the recognition I gave you that day at the palace was not charity or sympathy, but acknowledgement of genuine service and sacrifice," she said. "Your Majesty, your words, and your salute changed everything for me." James replied, his voice carrying an emotion that would have been impossible for him to express just weeks earlier. "For the first time since Afghanistan, I'm beginning to believe that my service might have value and meaning beyond the mistakes I've made." Queen Camilla smiled with obvious satisfaction. "The mistakes you refer to were not mistakes at all, but impossible decisions made under extreme pressure with the intention of saving lives. The fact that not every outcome was perfect does not diminish the courage and character you demonstrated in making those decisions." During the reception, James also met family members of the soldiers whose lives he had saved during the incident in Afghanistan. Queen Camilla had arranged for them to attend the event, though she had not told James they would be present. The surprise reunion was emotional and healing for everyone involved. Mary Thompson, the wife of Corporal David Thompson, one of the soldiers James had saved, embraced him with tears in her eyes. "Lance Corporal Morrison, I've wanted to thank you in person for months. David is alive today because of your quick thinking and courage. Our 2 children still have their father because of what you did that day." The conversation with Mary and the other family members provided James with a perspective on his actions that he had never allowed himself to consider. While he had focused obsessively on the civilian casualties, he had never thought about the military families who had been spared the loss of a husband, father, son, or brother because of his split-second decisions. Over the following months, James continued his recovery with the support of the resources Queen Camilla had connected him with, including specialized counseling for combat veterans, and participation in support groups with other soldiers who had faced similar challenges. The combination of professional help, peer support, and the ongoing recognition of his service created a foundation for healing that had not existed before Queen Camilla's intervention. 6 months after the salute incident, James was selected for promotion to corporal and was given the additional responsibility of mentoring new guards who were transitioning from active combat duty to ceremonial service. His own experience with trauma and recovery made him uniquely qualified to help other veterans navigate the difficult adjustment process. The mentoring role became a source of purpose and meaning for it. James that helped complete his own healing journey by sharing his story and the lessons he had learned about recovery and self-acceptance. He was able to help other veterans avoid some of the isolation and self-blame that had characterized his initial struggle with combat trauma. James also became an advocate for military mental health services, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of recognition, support, and understanding in the recovery process. He often shared the story of Queen Camilla's salute as an example of how powerful it could be when someone in authority took the time to acknowledge a veteran's service and worth. 2 years after the original encounter, Queen Camilla invited James to accompany her on a visit to a military hospital where she was meeting with wounded veterans and their families. During the visit, James had the opportunity to share his story with other soldiers who were struggling with trauma and guilt, offering them the same hope and perspective that Queen Camilla had provided to him. "The most important thing I learned," James told a group of wounded veterans, "is that we are not defined by our worst moments or our most difficult decisions. We are defined by our willingness to serve others, our commitment to doing what's right even when it's hard, and our courage to continue moving forward even when we carry heavy burdens." The visit to the military hospital marked a full-circle moment for James. He had transformed from a struggling veteran who questioned his own worth into a mentor and advocate who could help others find their path to recovery and self-acceptance. Queen Camilla's simple gesture of recognition and respect had catalyzed a healing process that extended far beyond James himself to touch the lives of countless other veterans. Years later, James would look back on that morning at Buckingham Palace when Queen Camilla asked him for a salute. He would remember it as the moment when his real recovery began. Not because the salute erased his trauma or guilt, but because it provided him with the recognition and validation he needed to begin seeing himself as worthy of healing and capable of continuing to serve with purpose and meaning. The story of Queen Camilla's unprecedented salute to Lance Corporal James Morrison became legendary within military circles. It's not just as an example of royal compassion, but as proof that recognition and acknowledgement could be powerful tools in helping veterans overcome the invisible wounds of service. It demonstrated that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from grand gestures or expensive treatments, but from simple acts of human recognition that remind veterans their service matters and their sacrifice is seen and valued by those they have sworn to protect.